If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, and it shall be given him. So is James's counsel and corresponding promise to Christians. So my question to us is, do we heed that counsel? Do you find yourself pretty regularly praying for wisdom? Notice James prefaces that by saying, if you recognize your lack of it. So one of the things that would find us approaching God through the avenue of prayer and seeking wisdom is an acknowledgement that we lack it to some degree, which suggests that we recognize we could have more and probably need more. And for that reason, we would be praying to God for it. I'm very thankful for James's promise. At the end of that verse, he says it will be given to those who ask. Now, there are some qualifiers, and we're not going to get into that. Verse 6, we have to ask in faith. We can't be wavering. But certainly it is at least cause for rejoicing and thankfulness that, as presented here by James, God is a God who listens to those petitions for wisdom. He doesn't upbraid us for it. He doesn't cast it back into our teeth, if you will, saying, well, I've given it to you and you haven't done well with it so far, but He grants those petitions when we ask for wisdom. Again, one of the reasons, as suggested by James, is because we recognize a lack of it, a need for it. May I suggest also that would be coupled with our having a great esteem for wisdom? You know, there are some things that we might lack but don't feel compelled necessarily to ask God for it. I'm not trying to be trite and trivial in this, but I'll be honest, I don't have any pets. And so I guess you could say I'm lacking pets. But you know what? I'm not asking God for any. I don't necessarily care for any. So, you know, there may be that scenario where we are lacking something, but not necessarily feeling a great need to ask for it because it's not something that we highly value. But wisdom. I would hope that one of the things that would find us going to God in prayer asking for wisdom is because it is something that we not only recognize we could use more of, but we highly value it. And for that reason we are, again, maybe on a regular basis, maybe daily, maybe several times a day, asking God for wisdom. With God's promise, He will grant it. I mention that by way of an introduction because the last time we were together, we found that there was somebody who acted on this, and God did answer in an extraordinary way. You remember Solomon from the Old Testament? When he ascended to succeed his father as king over the nation of Israel, God appeared to him and said, Solomon, ask for anything that you would want, and I'll give it to you. And Solomon, as we noted at a very extraordinary age of maybe 20, he valued wisdom so much that that's what he asked God for. God goes on to say, well, you know, you could have asked for riches, you could have asked for honor, you could have asked for your enemies, but you asked for wisdom. And so God said, I will give it to you, Solomon. And along with it, I'll give you those things you didn't ask for. And for this reason, we found in Solomon a man extraordinarily wise. God said He would bestow upon Solomon a wisdom that surpassed all others. But also God gave him those riches and honor and peace over his enemies, even the things he could have asked for, but he did not. All of that speaks to the fact, number one, God does answer prayers. When His servants ask for wisdom, we have a precedent. We have an example. We have something that we can look back on and say, God answered Solomon's request. And so that should give us confidence, right? It should give us encouragement to ask, knowing that God will answer. But number two, it speaks to Solomon's valuing wisdom. When God offered him anything that he wanted, Solomon valued wisdom more than anything else. And again, I pose the question, is that true of us? How much do we value wisdom? Solomon asked for it, God granted it to him. It speaks to Solomon's great, estimation of wisdom. But do you remember what we noticed also last week? How that others, now hearing about the wisdom of Solomon, went to great lengths to come and hear Solomon. We talked about the Queen of Sheba from southern Arabia. Jesus said she came from the uttermost parts of the earth. The best I can estimate, she probably traveled about 1,000 miles. Why? Just to hear Solomon's wisdom. And she came with great gifts, thinking that whatever she was going to get from Solomon, it was worth whatever she had to pay. And she said, it is said of her that she came with a train, if you will, full of camels and precious spices and riches. And she wasn't the only one. The Bible reports that all the earth came to hear Solomon. Look with me again at 1 Kings chapter 4. 1 Kings chapter 4. Solomon's request for wisdom is found in chapter 3. But in chapter 4, verse 29, and God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding exceeding much and largeness of heart, even as the sand that is on the seashore. And Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country and all the wisdom of Egypt. Notice how some of that wisdom was manifested. Verse 32, he spake 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. And he spake of trees, from the cedar tree that is in Lebanon, even unto the hyssop that springeth out of the wall. He spake also of beasts and of fowl and of creeping things and of fishes. And notice, and there came of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon from all kings of the earth, which had heard of his wisdom. And again, when you turn over to chapter 10, that reports on the visit of Queen of Sheba and her response. But look past there a little bit and look at verse 24, 1 Kings chapter 24. And all the earth sought to Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. And they brought every man his present, vessels of silver and vessels of gold and garments and armor and spices, horses and mules, a rate year by year. Let me ask you, do you think those people valued wisdom? Traveling the distances that they did, the inconveniences that would have necessitated, and then bringing with them great riches. Why? All because they valued wisdom that they had come to discover God had granted to Solomon. I know this is hypothetical, but if you would have been one of those, would have you come? Would have you traveled a great distance to hear Solomon? Would you have brought whatever wealth or riches and treasures you had to pay for it? Friends, aren't you thankful? Aren't you thankful that we can benefit from Solomon's wisdom and we don't have to do that? The only thing we have to expend, the only thing we have to give is time and effort. And so as we introduced last week, the beginning of a short series of sermons dealing with wisdom, our valuing it as we should, And if that is the case, asking God for it and recognizing where, at least in part, God has provided it. Friends, you remember Solomon wrote 3,000 Proverbs? Did you realize he preserved some of those for us? God in His wisdom has given us the Proverbs that have issued out of Solomon's wisdom. Now, it required ancient kings and queens to travel great distances, pay great expense to get it. You know what we have to do? Sit in the comfort of our own home, open our Bible, and read it. Spend time with it. And I would submit, it's my judgment, my opinion, but I would submit if we're praying to God for wisdom and then fail to avail ourselves to some of the wisdom that God has made available to us, maybe we're not so sincere in our prayers. Or maybe we just don't value wisdom as we should. Talking about the Queen of Sheba again, I just want to reiterate something we talked about last week for those who weren't here and even for those of us who had heard it before. Remember what the Queen of Sheba said about those who could be in Solomon's presence? Happy. I saw Tracy back there say it. Look at 1 Kings chapter 10 and verse 8. After it says she saw all that she saw of Solomon, and she said, Solomon, I heard the report and I didn't believe it, but now that I've seen it, I realize the half hasn't been told. The half hasn't been told. And listen to what she says, verse 8, happy are thy men, happy are these thy servants which stand continually before thee and that hear thy wisdom. This woman that traveled 1,000 miles, brought all of these riches, she said, I've been privileged to hear Solomon, but oh, how blessed are those who are in your presence every day, who are privileged to hear your wisdom daily. Friends, that could be us. That could be us. If we value it as much as she did. If we value it as much as Solomon did. If we understand that God has made it available to us. And all we have to do is open our Bibles, invest the mental effort and energy to learn it. Invite your attention to the book of Proverbs and again, remind us of the challenge that is before us. And I know some of you are getting it late into the month. But I read this challenge from another author and I took it to heart. I've done it in the past and invite you to do it. Read a proverb. Read a chapter of Proverbs every day of the month. Now, you're starting January 21st today. You're in the rears already because you should have started January 1st. And that way, when you get to the end of the month, guess what? You have read the entire book of Proverbs. If you do that for a year, you will read through the book of Proverbs 12 times. One writer said, having done that was probably one of the best spiritual tonics he could ever take. The practical counsel that you will find in the book of Proverbs just speaks to the wisdom of God that we should be seeking. The wisdom that God had bestowed upon Solomon, and he has shared it with the world. So, I encourage you, again, maybe you can't do it for January, but you start February 1 and you read a chapter of Proverbs each day. Now, there are some months, like February, you're going to have to read 2 or 3 one day. But they're short chapters. Again, I suggested maybe 15 minutes. I've tried to time myself. That's about what time it takes. 15 minutes to read through a proverb. You don't want to do it too hurriedly. You want to take time to muse over it and contemplate it. But friends, please don't substitute this for your daily Bible reading. Just add it to it. 15 minutes out of the day. Add it. And I concur with the author. It will bring great riches. That's how the Bible presents wisdom. That's how wisdom presents itself. It's a treasure that we ought to, again, value highly. In fact, let me invite you to Proverbs chapter 8 quickly, Proverbs chapter 3. Proverbs chapter 3. Once again, we encounter that word happy. The Queen of Solomon said, happy are those men that are able to be in your presence, Solomon, and to hear this wisdom daily. And so here again, Solomon, in the Proverbs that had been recorded for us, notice what he says concerning this wisdom. Again, Proverbs 3, verse 13, happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding, for the merchandise of it is better than the merchandise of silver, and the gain thereof than fine gold. Wisdom is personified. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things thou canst desire are not to be compared unto her. How much do we value it? Wisdom says, I'm worth anything that you would have to give. I am more valuable than anything that you could possibly desire. And so again, we applaud Solomon. And again, we commend those ancient kings and queens. But I can be among that number. I can. Sitting at the feet of Solomon, gleaning from the wisdom that was bestowed upon him in an extraordinary measure, in an answer to his prayer by God. So, having revisited those introductory remarks, this morning we're going to talk about the definition. Because as I suggested to you last week, this isn't going to be an expository, a comprehensive study of the book of Proverbs. I'm not going to do all the work for us. I'm going to leave that up to you. But thinking about wisdom as a treasure, obviously the pursuit of any treasure, like a treasure hunt, is going to necessitate some preparation. And so that's what I want to facilitate for us. I want to do some of the preparatory work. I want us to be adequately equipped so that when we go to the book of Proverbs and we sit at the feet of Solomon, we are better prepared to benefit from those wonderful riches and treasures that God has preserved through His inspired pen. One of the reasons I gave you a handout is because of the nature of this study. I don't know if you have come to, kind of sense this, but whenever you're dealing with definitions, all these words get kind of mingled up, and I've sat in, lessons and sermons where the preacher very astutely gives you a lot of help with words and things. But you know what? By the end of the study, a lot of times I have forgotten a lot of the things that I should have remembered. And so I wanted to put this resource in your hand, and so I thought this was a study that it might be good for you to have something written down that you can go back and study for future reference, and just have something that hopefully will serve beneficial. But friends, one of the first preparatory things that you have to do if you're going to go on a treasure hunt is to identify the treasure, right? Wouldn't it be kind of senseless to set out on a treasure hunt and you didn't know what you were looking for? I'm not sure that would be very effective. You wouldn't know when you found it, or if you ever found it. And so I believe one of the first things that we have to do in preparing for this quest for treasure, that is wisdom, is to know what we're looking for. And so that speaks to definition, right? Definition. What treasure is it that we're looking for? Well, in trying to understand wisdom, there's a number of resources we can use. The first one I provide some insight from is English Dictionary. And, as is the case with so often a noun form, wisdom, the first definition is going to be the quality of being wise. Well, that's not really helpful, is it? So now you're going to have to know what wise means. And that's the reason I put that little asterisk down there. So please look down on your sheet to the asterisk And there you'll see a definition for wise. I do think this is, again, very helpful in our, coming to better understand what wisdom is, what this treasure is that we're seeking. It says etymologically, it is connected with to know. But then notice, having or showing good judgment. That next word, don't let it scare you. I had to look it up. Sagacious. I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. But we'll come back to that because, again, you can look at the hashtag and there's a definition for sagacious. But also under wise, prudent, discreet, and there are many definitions, many applications that Webster gives under, the entry of wise. But back now to wisdom. All right, is the quality of being that, but notice the power of judging rightly and then following the soundest course of action based on knowledge, experience, understanding. Friends, I do know that's how Solomon thought of it. Because, again, if you're still in 1 Kings, look at 1 Kings chapter 3, where Solomon asks for wisdom. What was it, in fact, that he perceived in wisdom that he found so valuable? What was it that he was looking for? When God said you can have anything you want, Solomon says, well, I want wisdom, and then he explains why. Here's how he understood wisdom. What was he looking for? Well, again, look there at 1 Kings 3 and look particularly at verse 9. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart, notice, to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this thy so great a people? What was Solomon looking for when he was asking God for wisdom? He was looking for the ability to make good judgment, to discern between right and wrong. And so one of the definitions I gave from Webster is wise implies the ability to judge and deal with persons, situations, etc. rightly, based on a broad range of knowledge, experience, and understanding. That's what Solomon was looking for. Let me ask you, especially for those who were here last week, and many of you might know this even without having been here, but you remember how Solomon dealt with those two women that came to him immediately after God bestowed that extraordinary wisdom on him? He dealt rightly, right? He judged rightly with people. That's what he was looking for. That's what he was seeking. That's what wisdom is all about. Judgment, discernment, able to deal rightly between good and bad. Now, we'll come back to that word sagacious a little later on, but notice what it means. Webster used it in defining wisdom because, as you see in the hashtag there, having or showing keen perception or discernment and sound judgment. Foresight. Now, we can also be aided in our study of what we're looking for, wisdom, by looking at some of the original words as used in the Old Testament Hebrew and in the New Testament Greek. I'm going to let you do most of that study on your own. I did mention there that kind of oddly, in the Hebrew language, there's actually 8 words that are sometimes translated wise or wisdom in English. 8 Hebrew words that are sometimes translated that. Obviously, it can have various nuances and, some little differences by way of application. But again, basically the definition corresponds with our English definitions. To discern, to perceive mentally, to understand. I do want to reference a great resource that I found in dealing with understanding wisdom. A number of years ago, in 2007, the Cold Harbor Church of Christ up in Mechanicsville, Virginia, they put on an annual lectureship. And that lectureship theme was Wisdom Cries Aloud, Studies in the Book of Proverbs. The first chapter is the essence of wisdom by Brother Jimmy Clark. And I just want to highly recommend that lecture as recorded in this book. He provides great insight into those Hebrew words that are used in the book of Proverbs, some of the companion words, synonyms that are used for wisdom, and I listed some of those: understanding, knowledge, prudence, learning, reproof, and rebuke. You will encounter those as you study and read through the book of Proverbs. And all of them have ties to the basic study in Proverbs of wisdom. And so I just wanted to share those with you. I did give a quote because I really appreciate this from Brother Clark. Again, if you've left Proverbs, go back to Proverbs chapter 1. Proverbs is an interesting book of the Bible because it actually begins by stating its purpose. There's not many books that kind of begin that way in the Bible, but Proverbs does. Look at Proverbs 1, beginning in verse 1. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, 2. This is why these Proverbs have been recorded. 2, know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, and that purpose statement continues down through the next couple of verses. But Brother Clark says, I think appropriately and wisely, he says, there in that quote, therefore wisdom involves the mental capacity to know and the practical application in using it accurately when judging between matters of good and evil. Now, I ask us to read Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 2 because the next section has to do with definitions that I've come across, comments that I have heard concerning wisdom. And notice the first one kind of very much harmonizes with what Brother Clark was talking about. But there it offers this insight, quote, wisdom is mentioned first because it is the end to which all knowledge and instruction tends. Isn't that good? And so Solomon says, the reason I'm recording these Proverbs is so that you can know wisdom. And the commentary, pulpit commentary, is just suggesting the reason he said that first is because everything is directed to that. We'll have occasion to look at this later on, but notice Proverbs 4 and verse 7 just to kind of support that statement by the pulpit commentary. Look at Proverbs 4 and verse 7. Wisdom is the principal thing. You want to know what is the first thing? Principle, the first thing, the most important thing. It's wisdom. It's wisdom. And so the pulpit commentary is just suggesting that's why Solomon states it first. Everything else is leading to that. Everything else ultimately culminates in wisdom. And so if you're going to school, if you're learning by reading or through some other means of some other media, guess what? It ought to be leading to wisdom. Again, what is that? Well, look at some of the others. Look at that next one by a British poet named Coleridge. Common sense in an uncommon degree. That's a good way of looking at wisdom, right? Common sense, but in an uncommon degree. This one by Spurgeon is maybe one of the best to help us understand it and define it in very simple terms. It is the right use of knowledge. Again, going back to what we were talking about, everything is directed to that. Every effort to learn, every effort to better understand something is ultimately so that you can use what you've learned rightly, properly. And so wisdom, the right use of knowledge. An anonymous author said it this way: wisdom is knowledge using its head. And I don't know where I came across this one. I wish I did because I think it's excellent. Just look at that next one there. Doing the right thing without precedent. You understand what he's saying? He goes on to explain. He says, that means you know what to do in a situation even though you've never experienced it before. Boy, that is great wisdom, isn't it? How many of us learn through experience? And the experience usually isn't good. That's why we've learned the lesson, right? Oftentimes we talk to our children and say, you'll learn. You'll learn. But wisdom, this writer suggests, wisdom is the ability to know what is right before you ever have to go through that school. You ever have to go through the experience. I don't know about you, but that's one thing I would welcome. And in my prayers, that's one of the things I would certainly long to have. Brother Woods, in his commentary again, dealing with, that request or that petition or counsel by James to ask God for wisdom, notice what he says by way of explanation. Quote, knowledge is thus the possession of facts. Wisdom is the ability of judging soundly and correcting regarding those facts. Now, hopefully we have come to appreciate this connection between knowledge and wisdom. They're not the same thing, but obviously they are related. You remember looking back up there under wisdom, wise etymologically, it derives from what? To know. So wisdom and knowledge are related. They're not the same thing. Brother Woods, knowledge is possession of facts. Wisdom is the ability to use them properly. Okay? Now, I mention that just to again help us maybe have a fuller comprehension of wisdom and what it is that we're looking for. But I read this on a marquee in our area, and I believe it was at some educational facility, if I'm not mistaken, some institute for learning. But notice what it says there. Knowledge speaks, but wisdom listens. Now, I got to tell you, when I read that, I was in the car, so I was tempted to pull over because I had such a great sense of conviction. And here's why. I know I don't have to tell you, right, Ricky? I love to talk. I speak a lot. Now, that might speak to my knowledge, but it might not say much about my wisdom. Knowledge speaks, but wisdom listens. And that's more than just a catchy phrase on a marquee. Guess what? You start reading through the book of Proverbs, you will find that sentiment about wisdom. So, join me. Let's look at a few of these. I think I listed them there for you. But look at Proverbs chapter 2. And remember the scenario, if you will, the background for at least the first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs is essentially Solomon having a devotional with his children. It's as though Solomon's children are gathered there in their living room, and Solomon, as their father, is trying to teach them these great principles, these great maxims of truth. And so many times you will hear him use this address, my son, my son. It's as though Solomon is talking to his children. Now notice what he says, my son, chapter 2, verse 1, if thou wilt receive my words and hide my commandments with thee, so that thou incline thine ear unto wisdom and apply thine heart to understanding. How does wisdom come? Solomon says to his children, you need to open your ears. You need to incline your ears. This is a whole lot more about closing your mouth and opening your ears. Receive instruction. Incline your ear. Apply your heart. Another is found back in chapter 1. Look at chapter 1 and verse 5. It's immediately after Solomon's purpose statement, but notice what he says about a wise man. Because again, that's the ultimate end, right? In our quest for treasure, what are we trying to get? Wisdom. And once we get wisdom, how can we be characterized? A wise person. So here's what Solomon says about a wise person. A wise man will hear and increase learning And a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. Another is found in Proverbs chapter 8. Proverbs chapter 8 is a sublime section of Scripture. I've read some commentators that suggest this really is presented the whole way through, the early chapters of Proverbs, maybe all the way to the end. But Proverbs chapter 8 finds Solomon presenting wisdom as a female companion. It's like a woman. She's presented in a female form. And so it speaks of her as she. And notice the personification of wisdom. Notice what she says. Proverbs chapter 8, look there at verses 5 and 6. O ye simple. Now this is Proverbs. This is wisdom speaking. And she says, O ye simple, understand wisdom. And ye fools, be you of an understanding heart. Hear. That's how you're going to get wisdom, is listen. For I will speak of excellent things, and the opening of my lips shall be right things. Here is wisdom saying, if you want to really benefit from me, you got to listen. Listen. Knowledge speaks, but wisdom listens. And finally, by way of an application, look at Proverbs chapter 18. All this is kind of, an abstract. All this has to do with how you get wisdom, but how then will it manifest itself? Well, look again, Proverbs 18 and verse 13. And I got to tell you, this is another one of those convicting passages in Proverbs. Proverbs 18:13, he that answereth a matter before he heareth. You ever been there? I don't know how many of you can relate to this, but have you ever been in a discussion? And a discussion usually means it's two ways, right? Have you ever been in a discussion and when it's the other person's time to talk, what are you thinking about? I'm thinking about what I'm going to say next. See, I'm not listening at all. I'm really not intently listening to what they're having to say. It's supposed to be a discussion, a dialogue. But what I'm thinking about, what my mental faculties are devoted to, is what I'm going to say next. Proverbs says, the person who so answers a matter without listening to it, that's a fool. That's not wisdom. That's not wisdom. The person who tries to answer a matter before they hear it, and I'm guilty, brethren. I'm guilty. Sometimes it's with my grandkids. You ever asked your grandkids what they were doing, and before they ever get to tell you, you're accusing them? I've been there. And it's not just with grandchildren. Sometimes it's with adults. Well, this gem of wisdom says, when you try to answer something before you really listen, you're not acting wisely. That's folly. That's folly. So again, knowledge and wisdom, they obviously are related. And maybe that marquee just really summed it up well. Knowledge speaks, but Ricky, wisdom listens. Because wisdom necessitates listening. So listening is a prerequisite to get wisdom, but then as we see, wisdom then possessed will manifest itself in listening. Listening. All right, so finally, let me just offer this by way of my own personal observations. I will encourage you to hold on to these worksheets because we still got to get to the second major point of distinction. But if you will permit me to make at least these personal observations, I think you'll find that on the back. Back to our word sagacious. I didn't know what it meant. Please understand that. I had to look it up. But sagacious, as you remember, we defined it. It signifies having keen perception. And I know it's not inherent in the word, but when you hear perception, what sense do you think of? I think of seeing. When you perceive something, you're talking about seeing something clearly, right? Mentally seeing it. Perception. And when I put that together with, this idea of wisdom, here's what I came up with by way of the treasure that I'm looking for, if you will. I'm seeking wisdom. It says of itself, it's a treasure to be valued over everything and anything else. But to seek it, I got to know what it is. I got to ask, I've got to, properly define what it is that I'm looking for. And so I'll let you do that in your own way, but maybe it's helpful to you. It was helpful to me. I believe wisdom, this treasure I'm looking for, is perspective. Perspective. You may have heard me say in the past, that word means more to me every day, especially as I get older. Putting things in perspective. And again, why sagacious kind of drove me that direction is because of this idea of seeing something. Keen perception. Able to see something clearly. Because here's what perceptive means. It is to look through. That's what it literally means. It is two words, through and look, to look through. But here's one of the definitions as given by Webster. Perspective is a specific point of view in understanding and judging things or events. Does that all of a sudden ring a bell? What is wisdom? Judging things? It's a point of view in understanding or judging things or events, especially one that shows them in their true relations to one another. The ability to see things in a true relationship. What was it that Solomon was seeking? Wisdom. Why did he want it? He explained, because God, I'm all of a sudden, cast into this role where I've got to make good decisions. I got to judge between individuals that are coming to me. Who is right? Who is wrong? What is right? What is wrong? And what Solomon was looking for was, in my understanding, perspective. He wanted to be able to judge things from the proper perspective. He wanted to see things in their true light so that he could understand what is good, what is bad, what is best, what is better. So he could see that. Now, here's one of the things that I think is very helpful in making our segue to the next point. And we're not going to get to that today, but I just want you to see why this, at least in my judgment, was very helpful in defining what I'm looking for. You see, perspective was not only understanding and judging things, but notice from a specific point of view. From a specific point of view. And then Webster goes on to say that is to see them as they are in their true relationship to one another. And why that is going to make, I think, a very helpful segue to the next point is because, as I suggest there, under distinction, friends, even a cursory view and reading of the book of Proverbs is going to help us appreciate all wisdom is not something we should be seeking after. You can look at those yourself there in Proverbs, but you're going to find Solomon, who promotes wisdom. I mean, that's what this is all about. That's why he wrote. He says to get wisdom. And yet Solomon in the Proverbs is going to say on occasions, don't be wise in this way. You don't want to be wise like this. So that helps me appreciate all wisdom is not alike. There is wisdom that God wants us to seek after and find a great treasure. He wants us to be praying for it. But there is another wisdom that doesn't find God's approval. In fact, look at that second passage that I give you. Proverbs 26 and verse 12. Think about this. Seest thou a man wise in his own conceit? there is more hope of a fool than of him. Now, typically, we make those opposites, right? You're either wise or you're a fool. Solomon says there is a wisdom that you can have, and if you possess that kind of wisdom, it makes you worse than a fool. There's more hope for a fool than that person. So friends, we're going to have to see the distinction. We're going to have to distinguish between what God approves by way of wisdom and what doesn't get His approval. Matter of fact, He cautions against it. He says, don't have that. Don't have that. And you know what it's going to come down to? Point of view, how you see things, where you start. Where you start. If you want to do any study on your own, and a lot of this, friends, is, again, as I suggested, just offering my role as a facilitator to help you in the book of Proverbs. But if you have any reference works on Proverbs, read it. I had a section, and I might read from it next week, Lord willing, but I have a section in my Dixon Analytical Study Bible that talks about Hebrew poetry. And it makes the point. It says, Hebrew poetry and wisdom was very different from the other nations. And you know what was one of the primary distinctions? Is where you start. Your point of view. You see, the Hebrews start with what? God. There is a God, and from God, you can have wisdom in all of these areas of life. You know where the other nations started? The Greeks, for instance. They were known, quote, for their wisdom, right? Greeks seek after wisdom, 1 Corinthians 1. The Jews are looking for a sign, but the Greeks seek after wisdom. You know what? You know how they perceived wisdom? They looked at the world. They looked at the world and they said, okay, all of these things, belong to this world. And from that, they made their gods. You see how different that is? That was their wisdom. They took what was here and they made their God. Hebrews, the Hebrew religion says and wisdom says, God exists. That's why all this is here. Here's how we're supposed to use it. Wow, that makes a world of difference, doesn't it? And can you appreciate how the Greeks then had this problem with pride and arrogance and self-importance? Because they started with them. True wisdom starts with God. That makes a world of difference. We even use that sometimes, don't we? Sometimes we use the word wise and we don't mean it complimentary. Have you ever had somebody call you a wise guy? Are you trying to be a wise guy? That's not a compliment. And typically we don't receive it that way. So even in our common vernacular, sometimes we use wisdom in a way that's not favorable. And I'm suggesting God wants us to be able to distinguish between the two. One we should be looking for as a treasure. The other one we ought to be avoiding. And if we have it in us, we need to be getting rid of it. So one is to be valued, the other one is to be cast away. So hopefully we can discern that. You're welcome to study ahead if you so desire. But, obviously wisdom as inferred there by James, it comes from God. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, it is going to tell us that God in Christ, He's our wisdom. If you want to be wise in the true sense, you're going to have to go to Jesus. Even Jesus said to those cities surrounding the Sea of Galilee, He says, the Queen of Sheba traveled from the uttermost part of the earth to find Solomon, to hear Solomon's wisdom, and there is one who is greater than Solomon here. And you're unwilling to listen to him. If we want to be wise today, we need to listen to Jesus. He is, if you will, the true personification of wisdom. He is what Proverbs 8 was picturing for us. The personification of wisdom. And in Jesus, we can find God's wisdom for helping us or for making us right through the provisions of His sacrificial, vicarious death on the cross. And to be wise today is to be in Christ Jesus. You can only get there in one way. A heart filled with faith, believing Jesus to be the Son of God, gladly, humbly surrendering to His demands for our repentance, our confession of His name before others, and then our humble submission to be baptized by His authority. That saves us from our sins, but it also places us into Jesus, our wisdom. And that's where we can truly be wise.